when the first rays of dawn broke over the Lithuanian countryside on June 24th, 1941, nobody could have predicted that a single tank crew would hold back an entire German Panzer division for nearly 2 full days. This is just one of countless stories from World War II, where tanks transformed warfare forever and decided the fate of nations. Today, we're diving deep into the steel-clad behemoths that dominated the battlefields of the Second World War, exploring their evolution, their impact, and the incredible true story of courage that defined what it meant to face impossible odds. The story of tanks in World War II begins before the war itself. When the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of its military might after World War I, the German military didn't forget the lessons of armoured warfare. They studied, they planned, and when Hitler rose to power, they were ready to revolutionise how tanks would be used. Meanwhile, the Soviets were developing their own armoured doctrine, and the Western Allies were caught somewhere in between, not fully understanding what was coming. The tank, which had been a slow, cumbersome weapon in the Great War, was about to become the spearhead of modern warfare. Let's talk about the tanks themselves. On the German side, the Panzer family dominated the early war years. The Panzer Piedestal were light tanks, really more for reconnaissance and training than serious combat, but they taught the Germans how to coordinate armour with air support and infantry. The Panzer III, armed with a 50 mm gun, became the workhorse of the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, while the Panzer IV would go on to become the most produced German tank of the war. But it was the later tanks that would strike fear into Allied crews. The Panther, introduced in 1943, had sloped armour inspired by the Soviet T-34 and a powerful 75 mm gun. And then there was the Tiger. The Tiger In, with its 88 mm gun and massive armour, could destroy most Allied tanks before they could even get in range. Tank crews who faced Tigers often felt like they were fighting an invincible opponent. The Soviets, however, had their own trump cards. The T-34 is often called the best tank of World War II, and for good reason. It combined sloped armour, a powerful 76 mm gun later upgraded to 85 mm, wide tracks for mobility, and was simple enough to mass produce. Soviet factories churned out over 84,000 T-34s during the war, but the Soviets also had their heavy tanks. The KV-1, named after Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, was a monster. With armour up to 110 mm thick on the turret, it was nearly impervious to standard German anti-tank weapons in 1941. The Germans would discover this the hard way. The KV-2 variant mounted a massive 150 Metz howitzer in an enormous turret designed to destroy fortifications. It was slow, mechanically unreliable, but absolutely terrifying when it worked. The Western Allies had a different philosophy. The American M4 Sherman was designed for reliability and mass production. It wasn't the most powerful tank, and its armour wasn't the thickest, but America could produce them by the tens of thousands. The Sherman had a 75 mm gun, later variants got a 76 mm, and the British developed the Sherman Firefly with a powerful 17-pounder gun that could finally challenge German armour. The British themselves used Cromwell and Churchill tanks, along with captured equipment and American Lend-Lease vehicles. The French had been developing excellent tanks like the Char B1 before their defeat, but after 1940, most French armour ended up in German hands or scattered with the Free French forces. But tanks weren't just machines. They were crewed by young men, often barely out of their teens, who climbed into metal boxes and rode them into hell. Inside a tank, the heat was unbearable, the noise deafening, and the fear constant. Tank crews knew that if their tank was hit and caught fire, they had seconds to escape before the ammunition cooked off. The Germans called it brewing up. Crews developed superstitions, lucky charms, and unbreakable bonds. In the American Army, a tank crew was 5 men: a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver who also operated the bow machine gun. German crews were typically 5 men as well. Soviet crews were often 4, making them more cramped but requiring fewer trained personnel. Now let me tell you about the Battle of Rossini and the single tank that became a legend. On June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 4 million Axis troops smashed across the Soviet border on a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had the objective of capturing Leningrad. In their path was Lithuania, and the strategically important city of Rossini, which controlled crucial river crossings over the Neman and Dubysa rivers. The German 6th Panzer Division, part of the 4th Panzer Group, was one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, equipped with Panzer 35T, tanks captured from Czechoslovakia, along with Panzer IIs, IIIs and IVs. The Soviet defenders included the 3rd and 12th Mechanized Corps. The 3rd Mechanized Corps was particularly well equipped, with 31,975 men and 651 tanks, including some of the new T-34 medium tanks, and critically several dozen KV-1 heavy tanks. These KV tanks were a revelation and a shock to the Germans. Their armour couldn't be penetrated by standard German anti-tank weapons. The 37mm and 50mm guns that worked fine against Polish, French and British tanks simply bounced off the KV's thick steel. German tank crews reported shooting at KVs and watching in horror as their shells ricocheted away without effect. Some Soviet KV tanks, out of ammunition, simply drove over German anti-tank positions, crushing the guns and crews beneath their tracks. The initial German attack on June 23rd was swift and professional, as their blitzkrieg. Tactics had been refined in Poland, France and the Balkans, but the Soviet counterattack caught them off guard. Waves of KV tanks supported by T-34s and lighter BT and T-26 tanks crashed into the German spearheads. The fighting was brutal and confused. The Luftwaffe's Luftflotte 1 provided critical air support, bombing Soviet tank columns that had no fighter protection. The German 23rd Tank Division of the Soviet 12th Mechanized Corps was particularly hard hit, with Junkers Ju-88 bombers setting 40 vehicles ablaze in one attack. But on the ground, wherever the KV tanks appeared, German formations recoiled. By June 24th, the German 6th Panzer Division had split into 2 battle groups, known as Kampfgruppes. One was Kampfgruppe von Seckendorf, named after its commander. The other was Kampfgruppe Raus, commanded by Generaloberst Erhard Raus, who would later write extensively about this battle. Kampfgruppe Raus had pushed east of the Dubysa River and was positioning to continue the advance toward Rossini. They had established a supply line along a main road that connected their forward positions back to division headquarters. This road was critical. Without it, ammunition, fuel and food couldn't reach the front, and wounded soldiers couldn't be evacuated. On the morning of June 24th, local Lithuanian civilians reported something strange. During the night, a single Soviet tank had driven up to a crossroads on this critical supply road and simply stopped. It sat there, immobile, throughout the night. Some thought it had broken down. Others thought it had run out of fuel. A few witnesses would later claim they thought the crew had abandoned it. The truth was far more defiant. Early that morning, a German convoy approached the crossroads. This convoy was carrying Soviet prisoners of war and wounded German soldiers back from the front lines. As they neared the intersection, the convoy leader saw the lone tank sitting in the middle of the road. Before anyone could react, the tank's turret slowly rotated. Then it fired. The convoy scattered in panic, racing back to report what they'd seen. Meanwhile, Kampfgruppe Raus received confusing reports. Was this the beginning of a Soviet counterattack? Had they been flanked? As Raus tried to make sense of the situation, he discovered that the tank had severed his telephone lines, cutting communication with division headquarters. Before he could organise a response, a second convoy approached the crossroads, this one carrying ammunition and fuel. The lone KV opened fire with devastating precision. 12 trucks were destroyed in a matter of minutes, burning fiercely as their fuel and ammunition cooked off. Now General Oberst Raus understood the situation. It wasn't a massive counterattack. It was a single tank, sitting directly in the middle of his supply lines, and it showed no intention of moving. Traffic on both sides of the tank's position came to a complete halt. German vehicles began piling up, unable to advance or retreat safely. Wounded men languished without evacuation. Fighting units ran low on ammunition. The lone tank sat there and periodically fired at German positions in Rossini, visible from its position. Raus had to eliminate this tank, and he had to do it quickly. He ordered his anti-tank crews forward. 4 50mm Pak 38 anti-tank guns were positioned and opened fire. These were the standard German anti-tank weapons, effective against most tanks they'd encountered. The shells streaked toward the KV and struck home, direct hits. The tank sat silent and motionless. The German gunners congratulated themselves. But then, slowly, deliberately, the KV's turret began to turn. It aimed at the anti-tank battery and fired. All 4 guns were destroyed in a devastating counter-barrage. Raus tried different tactics. He brought up a 105mm howitzer and attempted to hit the tank from a safer distance, but the indirect fire couldn't score a hit on the relatively small target. German combat engineers attempted to approach under cover of darkness to plant satchel charges, explosives that could potentially damage the tracks or blow open the hatches. Machine gun fire from the tank drove them back, though they may have succeeded in damaging one of the tracks. Still, the tank fought on. The Germans positioned an 88mm Flak anti-aircraft gun approximately 730 metres behind the tank's position. The 88mm Flak gun was one of the few weapons the Germans had that could penetrate heavy armour. It had been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but proved devastatingly effective against tanks. The gun crew carefully aimed and prepared to fire. The KV's commander, watching from his periscope, saw what was happening. The turret rotated. The KV fired first. The 80mm gun was destroyed before it could get off a single shot. For hours, the standoff continued. The sun beat down on the tank. Inside, the temperature would have been unbearable, easily exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. The crew had been sitting in that metal box since the night before, under constant attack, breathing choking cordite fumes from their own gun, their ears ringing from the impacts of shells hitting their armour. Medical historians studying tank combat note that crews under such conditions would have suffered ruptured eardrums, severe concussions, and extreme dehydration. Still they fought. Throughout the night and into June 25th, the tank held its position. By now the Germans had brought up additional forces. Raus developed a plan. He positioned several Panzer 35 Tarntaus light tanks from Panzer Battalion 65 to distract the KV. These light tanks couldn't hurt the heavy Soviet tank, but they could draw its attention. Meanwhile, under careful camouflage, another 88mm gun was positioned behind the KV. The KV engaged the light panzers, its turret tracking the small quick targets. Then the 88mm opened fire from behind. This time the Germans took no chances. 7 or 8 shots were fired in rapid succession. 2 of them penetrated the thick rear armour of the KV's turret. The tank fell silent, but the Germans had learned to be cautious. They approached carefully, watching for any sign of life. Someone knocked on the armour, perhaps thinking the crew was dead or had fled. Suddenly, the turret began to move again. The German soldiers scattered in terror. Someone, thinking quickly, threw a grenade through one of the holes the 80 Hemi team had punched in the turret. The explosion was muffled by the thick steel. Finally, the turret stopped moving. When the Germans cautiously approached again, they opened the hatches and found 6 Soviet crewmen inside, all dead. The Germans who had fought against this lone tank were stunned by what they found. The KV's armour was pockmarked with impacts from the 50mm guns, the shells having barely dented the thick steel. Only 2 penetrations were visible, both from the 88mm gun fired from behind. These 6 men, whose names were mostly unknown, had held up an entire Kampfgruppe, part of an elite panzer division, for nearly a full day and night. They could have abandoned their tank when it ran out of fuel or broke down. They could have tried to escape through the nearby forests and rejoin Soviet lines. Instead, they chose to fight. General Oberst Raus was so impressed by their courage that he ordered his men to bury the Soviet crew with full military honours. In 1965, long after the war, the remains were exhumed and moved to a Soviet military cemetery in Rusenia. A memorial marks their grave. 2 names are known: Yushov, PE, and Smirnov, VA, along with 1 set of initials, Sheich, NA, and 3 unknown warriors. This single tank action, while tactically small, was strategically significant. It delayed German supplies and reinforcements at a critical moment. It demonstrated to the Germans that the Soviets wouldn't collapse as easily as anticipated, and it showed the German High Command that their anti-tank weapons were inadequate against the new Soviet heavy tanks. The Battle of Rusenia as a whole was a German victory. By June 27th, Soviet mechanized forces had been largely destroyed, with the Red Army losing between 600 and 3,000 tanks compared to around 200 German losses. The way to Leningrad seemed open, but the delays, the unexpected resistance, the realization that Soviet tanks outclassed German armour, all of this contributed to the eventual failure of Operation Barbarossa. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front would only intensify. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history, involving 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, and 4,000 aircraft. At Prokhorovka, part of the Kursk operation, hundreds of tanks engaged in point-blank combat. The battlefield transformed into a hellscape of burning vehicles and desperate manoeuvres. Soviet tanker Vasily Grossman, interviewing survivors, heard stories of 45mm guns fighting Tigers at close range, shells bouncing off like peas, and hand-to-hand combat between tank crews. German tank ace Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger, destroyed 27 Allied tanks in a single engagement at Villers-Bocage in France. American tankers of the 2nd Armoured Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, fought from North Africa to Germany, destroying thousands of enemy tanks. The African-American 761st Tank Battalion, Patton's Panthers, served 183 consecutive days in combat, fighting through France, Belgium, and Germany, receiving a Presidential Unit Citation for their service. The evolution of tank warfare drove rapid technological advancement. Early in the war, tank guns were 30mm to 50mm owned. By 1945, guns had grown to 80mm, 90mm, even 100mm on the Soviet IS-2. Armour went from 30mm to over 150mm on the heaviest tanks. Fire control systems improved. Radio communication became standard. Tactics evolved from simple breakthroughs to combined arms operations integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. The Germans developed the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, using concentrated armour to punch through enemy lines, while Luftwaffe aircraft provided close air support. The Soviets developed deep operations doctrine, using massive armoured formations to exploit breakthroughs and encircle enemy forces. The Western Allies, with superior logistics and industrial capacity, overwhelmed German defenders through sheer numbers and careful coordination. Inside these tanks, the daily reality was far removed from strategic planning. Crews lived, fought, and often died together. The conditions were nightmarish. Tanks broke down constantly, requiring endless maintenance. Mechanical failures were more common than enemy action in many units. Crews had to perform field repairs under fire, replacing tracks, fixing engines, clearing jammed guns. When a tank was hit, the crew had only seconds to escape. The most common cause of death wasn't the initial hit, but fire. Tank ammunition, when hit, would detonate in a chain reaction called catastrophic kill. The Germans called American Shermans Ronsons, after the lighter company, because they lit up on the first strike. American crews called the resulting fire brewing up. Many tankers preferred to fight with the hatches open despite the danger from shrapnel, because it gave them a chance to escape if hit. Combat doctrine varied by nation, but shared common elements. German tank commanders were trained to fight from hold-down positions, using terrain to protect their tank while exposing only the turret. They emphasized crew training and experience, with veteran crews far more effective than green replacements. The Soviets accepted higher casualties, but maintained numerical superiority and eventually matched German technical quality. Their crews were often less trained, but fought with desperate courage defending their homeland. American doctrine emphasized teamwork and combined arms, with tanks working closely with infantry and artillery. British tanks were organized into different types: infantry, tanks for close support, heavily armoured but slow; cruiser tanks for exploitation; faster but more lightly armoured; and eventually universal tanks like the Centurion that combined both roles. The tank battles of World War II occurred on every front. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps battled British and American forces across the desert in a campaign that saw fortunes shift back and forth for 3 years. At El Alamein, Montgomery's methodical approach and overwhelming material superiority finally broke Rommel's forces. In Italy, tanks struggled through mountainous terrain better suited to infantry. In France, after D-Day, Allied armour broke out from Normandy and raced across France, though German Tigers and Panthers extracted a heavy toll at places like the Falaise Gap. In the Pacific, tank warfare was limited by jungle terrain, but American M4 Shermans provided critical fire support in island assaults, particularly at places like Saipan and Iwo Jima. And throughout it all, on the Eastern Front, the scale of armoured combat dwarfed every other theatre. Kursk alone involved more tanks than the entire Western Front in 1944. The human cost of tank warfare was staggering. The 2nd Armoured Division lost 1,160 men killed in battle between 1942 and 1945. The 761st Tank Battalion suffered 36 men killed in action, 22 of them in November 1944 alone. Soviet tank losses were catastrophic, with entire tank corps annihilated in the early months of Barbarossa. German tank crews who survived became hardened veterans, but replacement crews in 1944 and 1945 often had minimal training and died quickly. The statistical life expectancy of a Soviet tank in 1941 was measured in days. Even in 1944, with Soviet forces on the offensive, tank losses remained severe. Allied tankmen in Normandy discovered that their Shermans were outmatched by German Panthers and Tigers, leading to desperate tactical adaptations. Tank destroyer units with more powerful guns provided support. Infantry learned to protect tanks from German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Artillery and airstrikes were called in to suppress enemy armour, but ultimately it was the men in the tanks who closed with the enemy and decided battles. The legacy of World War II tank warfare extends far beyond the war itself. The principles developed between 1939 and 1945 formed the foundation of modern armoured doctrine. The importance of combined arms, the need for air superiority, the value of logistics and maintenance, the critical role of crew training, all these lessons were written in blood on the battlefields of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The technological race between armour and anti-tank weapons continues to this day. Modern tanks are vastly more sophisticated than their World War II ancestors, with composite armour, guided missiles, thermal sights, and computerized fire control. But they still face the same fundamental challenge: how to protect the crew while delivering lethal firepower and maintaining mobility. And modern tank crews still face the same reality as their grandfathers. When the order comes to advance into enemy fire, you climb into your steel box and trust your training, your crew, and your courage. The story of the lone KV tank at Rocinii represents everything that tank warfare in World War II was about. It was about technology, with the Soviet KV's superior armour design giving it a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. It was about tactics, with the crew choosing a defensive position that maximised their advantages. It was about courage, with 6 men choosing to fight to the death rather than surrender or flee. And ultimately, it was about the human element. The fact that wars are fought not by machines, but by the men and women who operate them. Those 6 Soviet tankers, most of them unknown to history, changed the course of a battle, delayed a division, and earned the respect even of their enemies. Their story has been repeated in countless variations throughout history, wherever soldiers have faced impossible odds and chosen to stand and fight. From the deserts of North Africa to the steppes of Russia, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, tanks defined World War II. They were the breakthrough weapon, the exploitation force, the mobile pillbox, the infantry support, the hunter, and the hunted. Over 300,000 tanks were built during the war. Millions of men served as tank crewmen. Tens of thousands died in them. The survivors carried the scars, physical and mental, for the rest of their lives. But they also carried something else: the knowledge that they had been tested in the crucible of combat and had not been found wanting. When we look back at World War II, we remember the great generals, the massive armies, the turning point battles. But we should also remember the crews of individual tanks, like that lone KV at Rocinii, who wrote their names in the history of warfare through their courage, their skill, and their willingness to fight against any odds. They were the true steel giants of battle, and their legacy endures.